My stepfather, Richard, a retired cop who wore his old authority like a cheap, ill-fitting suit, sat on the stand looking completely at ease. He leaned into the microphone, a smug little smirk playing on his lips as he addressed the JAG prosecutor. "It was a tragic accident," he said, his voice dripping with a practiced sincerity I knew all too well. "She stumbled. The gun went off. She's fragile. Always has been." That one word, fragile, hung in the sterile, wood-paneled courtroom. It was the label he had branded me with my entire life, the one my mother never corrected. I felt nothing but a cold, hard knot forming in my stomach. The prosecutor, a woman with eyes that missed nothing, simply turned and announced, "The court calls General Marcus Vance." A formidable man with 3 silver stars gleaming on his shoulder entered, and the entire room seemed to snap to attention. Richard's smirk didn't just falter, it completely evaporated. The general walked past the prosecution table, his gaze sweeping over the court before his eyes landed directly on me. He didn't smile. Instead, he gave a sharp, respectful nod, a gesture of pure acknowledgement so foreign, in my world, that it felt like a thunderclap in the suffocating silence. Just 2 days earlier, I was on the verge of escaping that silence for good. I was packing the last box into my old sedan, the car key in my hand, feeling less like metal and more like a promise for a new life. This was it. My final escape. Then, a familiar shadow fell over me. Richard stood there, blocking the driveway with his arms crossed like a prison guard. Behind him, my mother, a woman who treated peace like a delicate vase that must never be disturbed, just wrung her hands anxiously. "Still pretending that little desk job is a career?" Richard scoffed, the sound a constant grating reminder of my place in his house. I tried to explain that I had a critical project briefing, that my team was counting on me. He just threw his head back and laughed. "A briefing? Honey, you answer phones for a living. Don't act so important." When I tried to step around him, he grabbed my arm. It wasn't violent, not in a way that would leave a visible mark, but it was possessive. A final, suffocating claim of authority. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and absolute. In that moment, I didn't just feel his hand on my arm. I felt the weight of every dismissed achievement, every condescending joke, every single time I was told my quiet nature made me less. It was the last time. He saw a broken girl playing make-believe. He didn't know that my little desk job required a security clearance higher than a state governor. Or that his attempt to control me would trigger a protocol he couldn't possibly comprehend. To understand how his world shattered in that courtroom, you have to understand the silence I lived in, and the secrets it kept. To them, my life was a narrative they had already written. It was a quiet, small story, and they were comfortable with it. I remember one Sunday dinner, the air thick with the smell of roast chicken and unspoken rules. Richard was holding court, as usual, telling a story for the 10th time about a minor commendation he'd received a decade ago. He polished the memory until it shone, a testament to a life of action and importance. Then, my mother, trying to include me, mentioned the professional award I'd received. It was a heavy, understated plaque that I'd foolishly left on the side table. Richard picked it up, weighing it in his hand as if to measure its significance. He squinted at the official government seal. "What's this for?" he asked, though he'd already been told. Before I could answer, he smirked. "Best use of the quiet game?" The joke landed with a dull thud. My mother gave a tight, forced laugh, the sound of a woman desperate to keep the peace. "Richard, be nice," she chided gently, then turned to me. "Eris, we just worry. Your deafness, this quiet little life, we just want you to be safe." They said safe, but I knew they meant small. In their eyes, my silence was an empty space, a weakness, a handicap that defined me as something fragile and helpless. They couldn't imagine a world where silence was a language, let alone a weapon. That world was my reality. It existed behind keycard access doors, in a place without windows known as a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. The only sound was the low, constant hum of servers and filtered air. It was the quietest place on Earth, and it was where I was the most powerful. I remember staring at a massive screen, watching the grainy, silent feed from a drone thousands of miles away. It showed a hostile negotiation. 2 figures in a dusty courtyard. The audio was useless, and my colleagues, some of the sharpest analysts in the world, were completely stumped. They saw nothing. But I wasn't listening. I was watching. My eyes caught it. A subtle, fleeting movement of the target's left hand, almost hidden by the folds of his clothing. It wasn't a nervous tick. It was a language. I leaned forward, my mind racing, deciphering the grammar of a silent, deadly conversation. While the experts saw a stalemate, I saw a hidden dialogue. The thumb drawn across the throat wasn't a threat. It was a confirmation. The slight tap of an index finger against the wrist wasn't a random gesture. It was a target designation. I turned to my team leader and my hands began to move, signing with a speed and precision they would never see at the dinner table. "He's not negotiating," I signed. "He's using a regional dialect. He's giving kill orders, asset code, Viper, authenticate, now." Within minutes, a catastrophic ambush was averted. My boss, a senior intelligence director who rarely showed emotion, walked over and looked from the updated report back to me. He didn't say a word. He just gave a single, profound nod of respect. In my world, that silent gesture was louder than any medal ceremony. In that room, I wasn't the fragile girl who needed to be kept safe. I was the expert. I was the asset. I was the one who saw the truth when everyone else was deaf to it. This was the duality I lived in. At home, I was a source of constant gentle worry, a disabled child in a woman's body. My silence was a problem to be managed. At work, my unique perception of the world, born from that same silence, made me an invaluable national security asset. I would hear my mother's voice in my head, making excuses for Richard's cruelty. "He just wants what's best for you," she would say. "He can be a lot, but his heart is in the right place." Her words felt like a fantasy, a desperate attempt to reconcile the man she married with the one I had to endure. But his heart wasn't in the right place. It was filled with a need to feel big by making me feel small. They lived in a world of loud opinions and empty words. I lived in a world where a single, silent gesture could mean the difference between life and death. The night he pulled the trigger, he forced my 2 worlds to collide. The argument in the driveway wasn't like the others. When he grabbed my arm, something inside me finally snapped. I pushed back, a desperate, instinctual act of defiance. For a second, his face registered shock, the expression of a man whose authority had never been questioned. That shock quickly curdled into rage. He told me he would teach me respect, and then he drew the weapon he always carried, the one that was a symbol of the power he used to have. He wanted to scare me, to put me back in the box he'd built for me. But then there was a deafening roar, a sound so loud I felt it in my bones. A hot, searing pain exploded in my side, and the world tilted. I was on the cold concrete of the garage floor, the metallic smell of my own blood filling the air. The rage in Richard's eyes was gone, replaced by something else. Panic. Raw, animal panic. His ex-cop brain immediately took over, the gears turning as he started building his lie. I could almost hear him thinking. The unknown intruder, the heroic struggle, the tragic accident. There was no remorse in his eyes. Only calculation. I knew then that I had to get out. His story would be the official one. He was the respected officer, and I was just the fragile, hysterical stepdaughter. He would be believed. So, I crawled. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony through me, but I pulled myself out of the garage into the cold night air. Through a haze of pain, I saw a figure across the street. A man walking his dog. I couldn't scream. I didn't have the air. I only had my hands. I lifted one, slick with blood, and began to sign, my fingers clumsy and weak. It wasn't a desperate plea for help. It was my training kicking in. It was a report. The man, who I now know was General Vance, stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened, not with confusion, but with pure, unadulterated recognition. In the hospital, the world was a blur of beeping machines and the sterile smell of antiseptic. My mother was there, weeping beside the bed, while a skeptical local detective tried to question me. I refused to speak. Words were Richard's weapon, and I wouldn't fight him on his own turf. I simply asked for a T-phone. The detective sighed, thinking I was a victim lost in trauma. He had no idea what I was about to do. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call a friend. I dialed a 10-digit secure number that was drilled into my memory. A number I prayed I would never need. My fingers trembled as I typed a single coded phrase, sending it out into the ether. It wasn't a cry for help. It was an activation. Richard thought he was dealing with his hysterical stepdaughter. He had no idea he had just assaulted a protected federal asset, and that a 3-star general was the primary witness. The wheels of a justice system he couldn't bully were already turning. The military courtroom was nothing like the civil courts you see on television. There was no chaos, no shouting. There was only a heavy, disciplined silence, underscored by the rigid posture of the uniformed officers. This was a world of protocol and procedure, of rank and consequence. It was Richard's worst nightmare, and he didn't even know it yet. He sat beside his lawyer, a man in a rumpled suit who looked completely out of his depth, like a tourist who'd wandered into a war room. But Richard, he still radiated a smug confidence. He genuinely believed his story. His carefully crafted fiction of the tragic accident was going to save him. He was the hero, the ex-cop, and I was the fragile girl. Across the gallery, I saw my mother. She looked small and lost, her face a mask of confusion and fear. I knew she was clutching onto Richard's story with all her might, because the alternative was admitting. She had spent years enabling a monster and ignoring the daughter who was sitting right in front of her. For a moment, I felt a pang of pity for her. She had built her life around a fragile piece, and that piece was about to be shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. But the feeling passed, replaced by a cold, quiet resolve. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just waiting. The system I had dedicated my life to was now in control, and it was a system built on facts, not feelings. Then, General Vance was called to the stand. He moved with an economy of motion, his uniform crisp, the decorations on his chest a quiet testament to a life of service and honor. He was sworn in, his voice calm and steady, filling the silent room with an unshakable authority. Richard watched him, a flicker of unease finally showing in his eyes. He likely saw the general as just another witness, someone who would corroborate the chaos of that night, unwittingly supporting his story of a heroic defense against an intruder. The JAG prosecutor began her questioning, her voice sharp and precise. "General, can you please recount the events of that evening?" she asked. He began by describing how he found me, crawling from the house, bleeding in shock. Richard visibly relaxed at this part, nodding along as if to say, "See, just as I said." The general spoke with irrefutable clarity, his words painting a grim picture of the scene. He detailed my injuries, the blood on the ground, the obvious pain I was in. He spoke about how I was unable to speak, how no sound was coming from my mouth. My mother started quietly crying. And then, the prosecutor led him to the moment that would change everything. She was severely injured, the general stated, his eyes fixed on the court. She couldn't speak, but she was communicating. A single pointed question from the prosecutor hung in the air. "What was she communicating, General?" General Vance paused for a beat, letting the weight of the moment settle. "She wasn't signing for help," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "She was giving a threat assessment." The entire room seemed to lean in. Richard's face, which had been a mask of concerned sincerity, began to crumble. The general continued, using a combination of tactical ASL and classified hand signals. She identified the assailant as a former law enforcement officer. She specified the weapon was a 9mm semi-automatic, indicated his state of mind was agitated and irrational, and confirmed the number of rounds fired. Each detail was a hammer blow, systematically dismantling Richard's fiction. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. I risked a glance at Richard. His face was ashen, his mouth slightly agape. This wasn't happening. The fragile girl wasn't supposed to be an expert witness to her own attempted murder. The general's voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear. It wasn't a plea for help from a victim, he concluded, his gaze sweeping over the court. It was a field report from a wounded operative. The shock in the courtroom was palpable. This was the moment the ground shifted, the moment my two worlds, the one they invented, for me and the one I had built in secret, collided with the force of an explosion. But the general wasn't finished. The prosecutor asked him how he could possibly recognize such specific signals. His answer was the final, devastating blow. "I recognize the signals," he stated, "because I was personally briefed on them as part of the charter for Operation Silent Shield, an advanced signals intelligence program that Dr. Thorne personally designed and currently leads." He then turned, his body swiveling in the witness box, and looked directly at the man who had tormented me for years. The general's voice dropped. No longer just a witness, but a commander delivering a verdict. "Your stepdaughter isn't just a linguist, sir," he said, the word "sir" dripping with contempt. "She is one of this nation's most critical assets in signals intelligence. By attacking her, you didn't just commit a felony, you compromised national security." Absolute silence. I looked at Richard. He was gone. The smug ex-cop, the man of authority, the ruler of our house, all of it had been stripped away, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. Then I looked at my mother. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a horrifying, dawning comprehension. In that moment she was finally seeing me, not the broken, quiet girl she pitied, but the powerful, capable woman she had never bothered to know. And she was seeing her husband for who he truly was. The lie was broken. The truth was out, and nothing would ever be the same. My stepfather spent years using his voice to make me feel small. In the end, it was my silence, interpreted by a man of honor, that condemned him. The verdict came quickly. After the general's testimony, there was no room for doubt, no space for Richard's lies to take root. The word guilty echoed in the silent courtroom, a single, definitive sound that ended a lifetime of his noise. Guilty of assault on a federal officer. Guilty of obstruction of justice. Guilty of so many things that were never spoken aloud. I watched as they led him away in handcuffs, and in that moment, he wasn't a monster anymore. He was just a small, pathetic man, stripped of the borrowed authority he used as a weapon. The sharp, metallic click of the cuffs was the last sound I would ever need to hear from him. It was the sound of a chapter closing. As the room began to clear, my mother rushed towards me, her face a mess of tears and frantic apologies. "Aris, I didn't know. I swear I never knew," she began, her hands reaching out for me. But before she could touch me, two stoic Air Force security officers moved to stand between us. They didn't say a word. They were just a calm, quiet barrier, a physical representation of the boundary I had finally, painfully, erected. They were a symbol of the world I had chosen, a world that was now protecting me from the one I had survived. My mother's pleas faded into the background as General Vance walked over to me, He looked at me not with pity, but with profound respect. "Welcome back, Doctor," he said simply. And with those 3 words, the ordeal was over. A year can change everything. The physical scars faded, and the emotional ones. They became a map of where I had been, not a sign of where I was going. I stood before a new class of intelligence analysts, my own team, in a state-of-the-art briefing room. I was no longer just an analyst. I was the director of the newly formed Non-Verbal Threat Intelligence Task Force. Many of the bright faces looking back at me were deaf or hard of hearing, recruited specifically for the unique linguistic skills that the world had once dismissed as a deficiency. Here, their silence was their strength. My office was minimalist and clean, a place of quiet order and purpose. A world away from the emotional chaos of the house I grew up in. I had learned that a legacy isn't something you inherit or are given. It's something you build, sometimes in secret, with the parts of yourself that no one else values. My new life was defined by a different kind of family. One afternoon, I was having lunch with General Vance and my senior team leads. The conversation flowed seamlessly, a comfortable mix of spoken English and fluid American Sign Language. There was laughter, debates over intelligence intercepts, and an easy camaraderie that felt more real and more supportive than anything I had ever known. It was a family forged in mutual respect and a shared, silent purpose, not in dysfunctional obligation. I looked around the table at these brilliant people who saw me for exactly who I was, who valued my mind and my skills without question. A profound sense of peace washed over me. This was belonging. This was home. Later that day, a notification appeared on my encrypted work device. It was a heavily vetted personal email that had been cleared through security channels. It was from my mother. My heart didn't pound, my hands didn't shake. I just felt a quiet, tired stillness. I looked at the subject line, which simply read, "Please, Aris." I could imagine the contents. A long, rambling letter filled with excuses, justifications, and a desperate plea for a forgiveness I didn't have to give. For a moment, I considered opening it. A flicker of the old me, the daughter who always felt responsible for her mother's feelings. But then I took a deep breath. Her peace was no longer my responsibility, mine was. Without reading a single word, I dragged the message to a secure archive folder. I didn't delete it. I just filed it away. A piece of a past I no longer needed to visit. Then I turned back to my work, to the team that was waiting for me, and a small, genuine smile touched my lips. My peace was finally and completely non-negotiable. For most of my life, I thought I had to speak to be heard. I learned that true power isn't in the noise you make, but in the impact your silence has on the world.